glad that you've joined us, and we hope that this will provide information that will be helpful to you and your congregation. I'm going to turn it over to Lori Gunther-Rieser, who will take it away. Go ahead, Lori.
All right, thanks, Karen. I'm hoping that you're looking at the same screen that I am looking at that says, Jesus talks about money, we can too. And if you can see that, you'll see that there's some pictures on there. I'm guessing that you probably can tell which parables those are. There's a woman with a broom and a candle, and that would be the woman looking for the lost coin. And then there's a tower, and all you New Testament experts I know will remember the parable where Jesus says, hey, who if among you, if you were building a tower, wouldn't think about how much that's going to cost? And then there's a picture of a vineyard, and boy, does Jesus tell stories about vineyards. My favorite story, or maybe the one that grabs me and shakes me the most, is the man who has a vineyard and hires workers, and he hires some in the morning and pays them their wages, and hires some at noon, and hires some even late in the day and still pays them their full day wages. That is a parable that has a lot in it. I don't think I fully understand it, but I know it does. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We are the Presbyterian Church in Canada presenting this, and with many thanks to Presbyterian sharing and the contributions of so many generous people over time that allow things like this to happen. So we're grateful to the church and to all the people. I am Lori Gunther-Rieser, and that might not sound like a Presbyterian name. I mean, what is a Presbyterian name? But I'm Mennonite, and this is kind of what I look like. I'm a fundraising consultant and a speaker. I have studied church and giving for quite a long time now, both in practical terms and in theology. I also write poems and donate to charity and serve on boards. There was a time when I was a pastor as well, and I still consider myself to be quite a pastoral person. And above and beyond all of those things, I'm a wife and a mom, and that informs what I do a lot. If you're interested in finding out more about what it is that I do or what I've written, I have a blog. It's lgrieser.com. And that's the rest of the slide really just says that I've gone to school for way too long. Most recently, I did my Doctor of Ministry, and I researched why Christians give. So I was privileged to do focus groups and surveys in 5 provinces, talking to generous people, and it really informs everything that I've said since. The next slide says, please type in your questions, or I think that's the best way to do it, is to type them in, and Karen will read them out during the breaks. Please don't hesitate to ask. I just totally welcome and encourage questions. There is no such thing as a silly question. So there'll be several question breaks during the presentation and then again at the end, and you can always type your question in at any time, and Karen will store up all those questions for the right spot. Okay, do you see a picture of Jesus with a very striking red cloak on? Can anyone identify what parable or what story from the Gospels this might be? I think it's important to look at Jesus, what everyone is pointing to, and there is a coin. I don't know how awkward it's going to be for everyone to try to type in what this story is. I'll give a pause, and we'll just all sort of do our best game show thing. Okay. Well, I'm just gonna assume that you know that this is the story of the with render unto Caesar, the story where they're saying, well, they're trying to trap Jesus and saying, is it lawful for you to pay the tax or not? And Jesus says, well, whose picture is on the coin? And we're going to come back to that story more than once. It's a really foundational story in my mind about how Jesus thinks about money. What about this one? I bet you know what story this is. It is at temple, and there is a widow who is putting in everything she has. The story of the widow's mite. And that one is something that gets used all the time, and it's something that I could talk possibly for weeks about. But for now, we'll just say, boy, Jesus sure seems to be talking about money in the Bible. What about this one? A man pulling a coin out of the mouth of a fish. again, that people are trying to get Jesus in trouble, and they're saying, well, hey, how come you and your disciples aren't paying the temple tax? What's with that? And then Jesus sends one of his disciples out to go fishing, and they pull the coin required for the temple tax out of the mouth of a fish. That is really an interesting story and something that I've written about in a past life. Okay, another story. You see animals coming out of the temple. Yes, this would be Jesus clearing the temple courts of all the activity that was going on with ripping people off, because there was special currency that you needed to use to buy your offerings at the temple. So that is a story that we tell a lot too. And you see another picture, and it is a man coming to see Jesus. Now this one is hard to guess because lots of people came to see Jesus. But this is the parable of the rich young ruler, where this man has done so much right. He's followed the commandments. He's really kept all the teachings right from since as early as he could remember. And Jesus says, you know, that's great. You just have one thing left to do, and that's go sell everything and come follow me. And that's where the man walks away. And you must know this one too. It's not literally supposed to be the eye of a needle as depicted here, but where Jesus says that it's difficult, but not impossible for a rich person to enter heaven. My point here is maybe not so much to elaborate on all these stories, and we could talk about what they all mean, and certainly there's not one single interpretation. Theologians don't agree on much, and they don't agree on this either. But my point is to say that Jesus talks about money quite a bit. We're not going to be able to cover everything that Jesus said in one webinar in 1 hour. So here's what I'd like us to talk about. Tithing, because that's something that's a very familiar frame of reference. I've been in Presbyterian churches as part of my another project, a generosity assessment project, so I've had the opportunity to talk with quite a few of you, and I know that tithing comes up. I'd also like to talk about the circle of grace model of giving, and that is something that I've developed from my own writing and researching into giving, and we'll talk more about that. It's quite a simple model. And then I want to talk about Imago Dei, being created in the image of God. What does that mean with respect to Christians and money? And I find that to be just a very fundamental teaching about generosity and lots of things. And last but not least, I don't want to leave you empty-handed. I've suggested some books that I've personally found helpful on this topic and on Christian giving, and Karen Plater as well has resources on what's something you could put in the bulletin. We don't want you to leave empty-handed, as it were, but just to hear some of the things that are available. Okay, tithing. What did Jesus say? Before I get into the New Testament, I just have to, there's so many Old Testament texts that get cited in tithing, and there's certainly many, many texts on it. I think the one that is most commonly cited is this one from Malachi 3:10. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. And this text is a lovely text and has also been used in the prosperity gospel, which is to say, if you only believe the right things, that you will be healthy and wealthy and well. And if you don't, then if you're not those things, then it's a problem with your faith. So that's a distortion, and it's often based. This verse is very frequently cited. So when I was studying, I've had to write my own theology of tithing as well as summarizing many others, and I definitely cited this Malachi, which is used so often. And I think it's important for us to go back and read the whole text, the whole chapter of Malachi, where he prophesies about the offerings of righteousness that the God demands of us. And he talks about, Malachi testifies against people who would defraud laborers of their wages, which feels very telling in Ontario today, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and who deprive the foreigners among you of justice. Now, these are all issues that, could be on CNN and not just in Malachi. So in addition to that verse that we just read from Malachi 3:10, which is so often cited as sort of, if you give, then God will make you rich, we have to look at it in the whole framework of God cares about what we do with our money and with our whole system, everything. Okay, New Testament. I just had to get that Old Testament in there because it's so commonly used. But I do want to talk about New Testament. Now, I don't know how well this is going to work with comments, but does anyone know a New Testament reference to tithing? You'd think thered be a lot of them, but there isn't really. I'm going to give a pause, and again, this might not work out so well for people to jump in, so I will give you these references, unless you're on blueletterbible.com already looking them up. There's two references, very similar stories in Matthew 23 and Luke 11, and they are talking about the Pharisees who tithe on their mint and their dill and their cumin, but neglect mercy and justice and righteousness, which sounds quite a bit actually like the Malachi passage that we just talked about. And then there is Luke 18, where a religious leader is saying, hey, go me, I tithe. And then there's Hebrews 7, which is a really dense passage about the order of I'm not even going to be able to say the name right, Melchizedek, I think. So that one is pretty obscure and difficult to make out. And that's it. Those are the New Testament references to tithing. So it's often about spices and herbs. And I think that might come as a surprise to some of us sometimes, because it's so commonly discussed that we would think it's in the New Testament a whole lot more than it is. Now, I wanted to be sure to honor and respect the Presbyterian perspective on tithing, and was really pleased to see that the Presbyterian Church in Canada website has the link to a document called Stewards of God's Grace. And that is written by Herb and Shirley Gale, who many of you will know because Herb Gale served the Presbyterian Church in Canada faithfully for many years. He was served in stewardship. And he writes in this document the question, what about tithing? And I think many of us will know that tithing is the practice of giving 10% of your income for sacred purposes, and that it's frequently mentioned in the Old Testament, although various people will have various interpretations of whether it's tithes and offerings and how often and when and how. In the New Testament, tithing is never commanded of God's people, and those previous references sort of illustrate that. Jesus himself condemned tithing when it led to self-righteousness, and that's the previous reference that we talked about. The story of Zacchaeus, who gave more than half of his savings away, and we'll talk a little bit more of him. We won't have time today to get into Acts, but you think about Acts where people sell their land and bring the entire earnings from that sale, the entire sale, the results of that sale to the common good. So that's a really dramatic example of generosity and giving in Acts. So what does all this mean that there's such a diversity of texts about giving? And it challenges us that there's not a specific rule, but that we should learn to give with the same wholehearted generosity that we see in Jesus. Learn to give with the same wholehearted generosity that we see in Jesus. That is our goal and our highest aspiration, not just in financial giving, but in so many ways. Some observations that I've seen and experienced on tithing. First of all, it's great. It's way more than most Christians give. That's definitive. It makes a wonderful goal for people learning to give. People are giving at a much, something that you can aspire to. And an excellent baseline for me. I know people who give more than this, where they consider 10% to be their minimum baseline for giving. So those are some wonderful things about tithing. There's some risks about tithing too. You can see I've highlighted in red here, thinking that we can do whatever we want with the other 90%. And even Malachi was already concerned about that. That somehow if we give away 10%, that we can, go to Vegas and gamble with the rest or do whatever, that's ours. And the Vegas example is kind of extreme, but you know what I mean. There's a risk of tithing that can be legalistic, giving based on duty and obligation, and Jesus has something to say about that. At the same time, I want to say that I've met so many joyful tithers who give out of gratitude for everything that they've received from God. So I'm not meaning to say here that tithing is legalism, only that sometimes people can connect those two things. Some awkward things about tithing. If you're already visiting a food bank in order to pay the rent, then living on 90% of your income isn't a good option. And it's not really an accessible starting place for learning how to give for a lot of people either. Now, I said that I'd visited congregations, and sometimes I've heard people say, not everybody, but I have heard people say, we tithe here at, whatever church. And actually they mean this conversation is done. We tithe, end of story, nothing more needs to be said here. And I find that is usually not the case, that usually there's lots more that needs to be said and heard and listened to and discussed. For example, if someone is putting $20 a week into an envelope and they've faithfully done this for a long time, and maybe they've never really thought about changing that amount because that's what is meaningful to them, or a long established habit, that's $1,000 a year. And that is $1,000 a year is more than most Canadians give. I know that to be certain. But if this is a tithe, if $1,000 a year is a tithe, then what is their annual income? Tithing math is pretty simple. You just have to move the decimal over, one to the right. So if $1,000 a year is a tithe, then your annual income is $10,000. And I've been in the somewhat awkward position of doing this math to a group of church leaders, and when they say, hey, people are tithing, and I say, well, if people at your church are making $10,000 a year, do people drive here? Because you have a low-income congregation, and that's okay. It's fine to have a low-income congregation, but maybe the way we do ministry here needs to change to meet the needs of these very low-income people. And then what I've heard back is, oh, well, everyone drives here. I think, well, if that's the case, then there's something not quite right here. This is misrepresenting the giving. Tithing is misrepresenting the giving, because the incomes are higher than multiplying the tithe times 10 is not giving what the people's incomes are here. And that is an awkward conversation to have, but we do need to be honest with ourselves. We can't be hypocrites and claim to tithe when we don't. We really need to understand who's giving and why they're giving, and how we can encourage people to give, not because our church needs the money, but because God wants us to be generous. This slide you should be seeing is purple and blue and yellow and quite pretty, and is a giving guide, and is another way of helping people be generous. And it's summarizing the biblical principles of giving gratefully and cheerfully and intentionally and proportionally, which is a more joyful way than my previous example about the cars. But it's talking about joyful giving, and is a reminder of people of what the math looks like. If this is your income, then this is what your weekly giving at various levels could look like, just to make it easy for people to give and to be able to do the math on their own without, in private perhaps, or maybe it would be a great family discussion as well. But this is a way to get that, one of the ways to get that discussion started, and it's a bulletin insert that's available. You could talk to Karen, and she would be very helpful in getting. Very glad indeed for you to be able to get that. Is there more that you wanted to say on that, Karen?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, people can download it off our website, and it's a great way because it's been sent or it's produced by the Presbyterian Church in Canada to sort of give something to people to think about without feeling like you're really in their faces. Or you can also order it. We do have them printed, so you can contact me if you want to order copies of it, and we'll be sure that you get some.
Okay. I am so proud of myself for learning Presbyterian language. I would encourage people that are in church leadership, and I imagine that that's many of you on this webinar, to talk to your envelope steward, and I think that's the right word, about, what are the giving patterns? You're not asking to know how much Mrs. Jones gives or, what Mr. Lee's giving is, but what are the patterns? Do we have $20 in an envelope, or how much of our giving comes from pre-authorized remittances and those sorts of things? It's really important to have that conversation. All right. I've done a lot of talking. I would love to do some listening and to hear your questions. Karen will read them out.
What has been your experience when you have people who are starting to give? What would you encourage them to do if they're wondering about how much or where should I start? I know sometimes people have had a conversation about a modern tithe being 5% or 7%, or does it include my giving to other ministries in addition to my church? Do you have any thoughts on that?
More and more Christians give to a variety of causes, not just their church. And that's actually true for older donors as well. I mean, things have changed quite a bit in different generations. In terms of someone starting out giving, I would say give something and give regularly and see where it takes you. I think the most important thing is not the amount, but to start in a habit of giving regularly. And so, a pre-authorized giving is one way of doing that. That's not the only way. And to that end, I would want to encourage churches to make it as easy as possible to give. My son did come back from university, and we had to give him a little tutorial on how to use a checkbook. He doesn't use a checkbook anymore, but he did have that a couple of months there where he needed to write checks for rent. But make it possible to give electronically, to give through your, every month, like the PAR program, which is an excellent way. So I would say that the first thing to encourage in giving is to make it a habit, to give regularly and not so much worry about the amount. And I would want people to give to their church, but if it's another cause that is their, if the church camp is the way they start giving, I would want to encourage them to give regularly to the church camp and grow it from there. But just start giving regularly, see where it takes you.
Great, thanks. So you can keep going. I'll keep watching for questions, and if they pop up, I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Okay, Jesus talks about money, we can too. If I was the kind of person who could design a cross-stitch pattern, which I'm not, but if I could, I would make this into a cross-stitch pattern so that we could have it displayed in all sorts of places and church lobbies and stuff like this. Jesus talks about money, we can too. When we sing and when we hear the Psalms, we sing about the abundance of a generous God. Steadfast love is new every morning. His mercies never comes to an end. We sing and we read scriptures about God's limitless grace. So I think that we understand that theology at some level, although sometimes when it comes to church budget time, we throw all of that out the window and we just think, oh my goodness, there's not enough, there's never going to be enough. And we get ourselves squeezed tight into a closed fist of scarcity. But if we go back to our hymns and our psalms, we can remember that we worship a very generous God who gives to us abundantly. And it's based on my study of the Apostle Paul, and I've spent a lot of time studying the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 in particular. And from that, this model, I must credit is based on the writings of James Dunn. He didn't make it into a diagram, but I've made James Dunn's teaching on Paul into this diagram. It's not complicated. You see at the top is God. God is the source of everything. We really don't own anything. We're just borrowing stuff from God. And God gives us grace. If you can follow this diagram clockwise, God blesses us with grace. And that's where the new every morning comes in. And then there's people. We are both the recipients of God's grace and also people who are able to pass God's grace along in the form of gracious action. And that's donating to church and feeding the hungry and kind words and sharing all sorts of gracious action, money included. People who are the recipients of the gracious action, and we're in both categories. We're both the givers and the recipients. We respond to that generosity that we've received with praise and thanksgiving. Praise to God for all the good things that we've received. God continues to bless us with grace, and so the circle of grace model continues. So I'm hoping that that's a simple enough model to understand that we respond to God's grace with generosity. It might be one way of phrasing it. So what I'd like to do is take that model and apply it to a couple of New Testament stories just to make the model more real to us and as a way to illustrate how we might talk about money. If you can see this picture, it is a man in a tree. Zacchaeus. What a great story. I'm sure you know it. That Zacchaeus can't see Jesus, so he climbs up in a tree, and then Jesus says, well, hey, I've got to come to your house for dinner. And they do, and they have a great chat. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at this model. Now, in the handouts for this webinar, my writing isn't on the handout, so it will be when you review the video for this webinar, or if you want to take a screenshot now or scribble a few notes, you're welcome to do that, of course. So here we have God's grace flowing down to people. And when we think about Zacchaeus in particular, Zacchaeus received Jesus gladly. Now, what a very tangible reception of God's grace to have Jesus over to your house for dinner. And Zacchaeus received him gladly. And during the course of his encounter with Jesus, Zacchaeus was a tax collector and he had defrauded people, but he resolved right there and then to take gracious action. And I think you will be familiar with Zacchaeus' gracious action. He gives away half of his capital. Half of everything he has. In addition, he repays people. If anyone has been defrauded, he repays them 4 times. So he makes things right with people. Now, the story doesn't talk about the rejoicing of people who were repaid, but I'm sure they were very, very happy. It does say that Jesus' reply is that today salvation has come to this household, for the lost has been found. And if you read a little bit back in this story, something that comes before it is the lost sheep. So when the lost is found, that's a matter of great rejoicing for God. So this praise and thanksgiving in this story is coming from the people for whom Zacchaeus made restitution, but the praise is even coming from Jesus, rejoicing at the lost being found. So there's the model of the circle of grace model applying for Zacchaeus, where Zacchaeus receives God's grace in the form of a personal visit from Jesus. And Zacchaeus responds to this grace with righteous action, with gracious action to all sorts of people. And I'm sure that people respond by praising God for Zacchaeus' conversion and for his financial generosity. I think the most meaningful praise is Jesus' praise about the lost becoming found. And we can only imagine how much the circle of grace continues as Zacchaeus continues to be generous, and as people who received money from Zacchaeus continue to be generous, and praise continues. I really had lots of stories in mind that I could do, but I chose this one because it's a negative example of the circle of grace where the grace gets interrupted. In Matthew 18, we have the parable of the unmerciful servant. There's the king in the story looking stern in the purple robe in this little picture, and he owes a lot of money, and he is forgiven. They don't throw his family into debtor's prison. This man has a huge debt forgiven. And then there's someone who owes him like $100, and this man just shakes down this person who owes him money and says, I'm going to throw you in prison and you'll never get out. And he just is completely unmerciful. Now, the parable is about forgiveness, but like all great parables, well, all parables, it's about a lot of things. So if we take this Matthew 18 parable, we'll start with God. Everything starts with God. We have experienced God's grace in that we do not get what we deserve. We do not get what we deserve. As with the servant in this story, we have been forgiven a great debt. Now, this man in this story has been forgiven a great debt, as have we, but he refuses to extend that mercy to other people. He refuses to forgive others. There's a great big X through his gracious action because God's mercy and generosity is stopping with him. He interrupts that cycle. He does not pass it on. Of course, then there is no one to extend praise and get thanksgiving on his behalf because he stops the chain. God is not impressed at all with the actions of the unmerciful servant. In the parable, the king is quite upset as well. I think I've got that right. In any case, God is not impressed with people who don't forgive. So you can see how this works with giving as well. We've all been given so much by God, and we respond to God's graciousness, to God's generosity to us, with gracious action to other people. And when we hoard God's forgiveness, God's grace, the resources that God has entrusted to us, we interrupt that cycle of grace that should be flowing to other people. So that is 2 examples of the Circle of Grace model. I'd like to use that model one more time in the Imago Dei, giving to God what is God's model. I'm not sure if my Latin is correct in terms of pronunciation, but Imago Dei means that we are made in the image of God. And then we give to God what is God's, and we are made in God's image. So what does that mean? Wow. So if you were able to join us at the beginning of the webinar, you will have seen this slide already, but if you didn't, that's fine. Here it is again. It is people trying to trap Jesus and saying, well, hey, do you have to pay taxes? What's with you? And they're pointing to the coin. And Jesus does not fall into their trap. He just says, hey, look at this coin. Whose picture is on it? And they say, Caesar. And he says, well, then, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto Caesar is how it's usually translated. And they say, and then he says, give to God what is God's. And we were made in God's image. So what does that mean? So here is a Circle of Grace model again, using that story. God is the source of every good thing. God has given us life and breath and salvation, and we are made in God's image, which is an enormous gift. So that grace flows to us. That's just inherent in being human, that we have so many gifts from God right out of the starting gate. And we respond to God's love with gracious action. We love our neighbor. And people, when recipients of that love, and we are again both donors and recipients in this model, we respond with praise and thanksgiving. We praise God. We love God with all our heart and all our mind and all our strength, which is how, if you read this story in the Gospels, that's what comes next. People ask Jesus also this important question. So when you think about what are the limitations, is there a limit? How much do we have to give? What are the limits of our discipleship? I can't think of anything that's suggested by this model. If we are made in the image of God and we give to God what is God's. Well, that doesn't really leave out too much.
So I need to confirm that.
Again, the devil is in the details. How does this actually live out? How is our journey of faithful discipleship actually, what is the next step? That's something that we pray about, and why we have a community of faith to help us work on that. But this is, I think, presents a model that we aspire to, that as we are made in the image of God, we strive to give to God what is God's.
Let me check in
okay. Yeah, let me know, because whenever you know.
And there is that picture in that parable. Give to Caesar, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. Now that is a lot of theological content. I've had a chance to think about this in advance, but you didn't. So I encourage you to have questions, to ask me anything that didn't make sense, or ask away. I'd be happy to discuss.
If anyone has any comments too, we'd be curious about, how do you talk about money in your church? Do you have anything you want to add?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's so much to learn from a group like this.
What have you found, Lori, that's the biggest challenge that people find to talking about money? And do you have any ideas or strategies for ministers? Sometimes they feel uncomfortable, I think, talking about it.
Yes, I think ministers do feel a little bit scared talking about money, because it's a taboo in our culture is what it is. And yet we know that half of Canadians are struggling with debt. So the silence and secrecy about money just doesn't serve us well, because we could be having tremendous problems that we feel we can't talk about. So if we can talk about what we're grateful for, I would say that gratitude is the best and the easiest starting point to talking about money and to talking about generosity. Is what are we grateful for? What are we grateful for in our church? What are we grateful for to the people that went before us in this church? Nobody arrived where we are. We didn't just fall out of the turnip truck. Other generous people have helped us get to where we are. So when we can talk about the generosity of the people that got us here, the generosity of people that continue to encourage us, that's a great way to start talking about money.
One of the participants shares that she learned to speak about offering in a different way from one of your other webinars. And in the preface of the Time Now, she prefaces it with examples of what the givings are offering us, how the givings are offering us the ability to do as far as ministry. So she's changed, and we'll talk and share about that.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Thank you. Oh, that's just great. Yes, I think I shared during that webinar how much I've learned from just watching the kids at our church and their offering, and the joy and the spontaneity that they bring to it. And yes, I'm so glad to hear that, and I continue to learn. We're all on this journey together, and just to start, I think gratitude is a great stepping stone, and then offering is a wonderful place to start with being grateful.
She's also noticed that the more she does it, the more comfortable she becomes doing it.
Well, bless your heart. That's right. It's like prayer. I mean, giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer, and we have many opportunities to pray regularly and spontaneously. So, I mean, if we only pray like when we're in crisis, that's not bad, but it's the true prayer. I don't want to use the term warriors, but the people that excel at the discipline of prayer are the people who practice it regularly. So the same thing is with giving. We want to practice giving regularly, and that's why I said for starting out that I think developing the habit is the most important thing, and then we'll be able to give regularly, and there'll be also many opportunities for us to give spontaneously. It's a spiritual discipline, and it takes exercising those muscles as well.
There's a question coming from North Bay. Tithing at 10% or whatever percent, does this apply just to the church, or does it include all that we give?
I hate to think that there's a limit on it. If you go back to our being created in the image of God and giving to God what is God's, I can't. I don't think that I would love for there to be sort of a wiggle room where we can say, oh, well, once we've done 12 and a half, we're good. I would be more comfortable with that too, because it's scary to think that there isn't an upper limit, but I really don't think that there is. I know it sounds like I'm trying to wiggle out of the question, but I think really it's like Jesus showing the coin and saying, give to God what is God's, and we're kind of left in that uncomfortable space of thinking, but everything is God's, So yeah, it's something that we pray about, and we study the scriptures, and together in our discipleship journeys we figure that out. But I can't think of a hard and fast rule. I know that would be easier, but I can't think of one.
I like to think, this is Karen, and when I've been talking to people and what's helpful at the church, I like to say it's important to decide a certain amount that you're going to give to your congregation if you're a member of the congregation and it's important to you, and it's sort of a discipline. It's like you giving to God untied, because the congregation can do it to use their ministry, and it's not designated. It's sort of, this is how I see God working through the congregation. So I know I decide how much I'm going to give to the congregation, and then I stick to that. But then I give to other organizations that I think are important. And I would say that's also part of the giving that I do. It's also a way of giving to God, but it's not as specific as when I give to the church. So some people might decide, for example, I'll give 5% to the church, but I still want to give 2% of my income to other things where I see God working and participating in that way. So I think it's a little bit of that discipline and sort of deciding how is God calling you to give and participate.
Mm-hmm. The research definitely tells us that people who plan more give more. And I'll just say that one more time. People who plan more give more. So the more that you're able to set up regular giving, so that discipline of regular giving, knowing that there's going to be opportunities for extra giving. I know we had the question in a previous webinar where the pastor says, well, I give pre-authorized, but then if the offering plate comes around, I'm not putting anything in, and that's gonna, that doesn't look very good. And there's certainly the opportunity to do both, to make your regular monthly donations through pre-authorized remittance, and then to make your then to top that up with cash on Sunday morning. So it can be a both and.
Mm-hmm. There's somebody else who's sharing that they tried a home visit campaign to talk about givings in the framework of gratitude for time and talents giving, and encouraging thought about how we give. But some of the elders felt really uncomfortable about approaching their membership. Any ideas or tips for that?
Tell stories, tell stories, tell stories. If you have 3 stories of the wonderful things God's doing in your church, because the people that you're sending are not getting a commission. It's this is not a pyramid scheme. This is helping the ministry of the church. So if you can say that you're helping 11-year-olds learn about Jesus, and you're providing a ministry where we go visit seniors in the nursing home and we sing hymns, and on Thursday nights, you might not know this, but on Thursday nights for 5 years we've had an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and that's keeping people alive. So just if you had 3 stories about the wonderful things that God is doing in your church, inviting people to continue to help those wonderful things that God is doing among you continue, that's a much nicer story to tell. And it's just inviting them to join in the good things that God is already doing. Does that help?
Yeah, and even that comment also said that they are trying to tie the money given to works completed, and to point out the value of giving to the church and sharing with them what's been happening through their food bank or their sponsored refugee family. So I think they are doing it. It's just still challenging sometimes.
Yeah, so I think it's like what the previous pastor shared, that it does get easier as you go. Mm-hmm. And even when you think about the electricity bill, I just read this somewhere. Grace Detty Pomeroy wrote it, that don't think of what the light bill is. Think of what is your church doing when the lights are on? Mm-hmm. I thought, that's perfect. I'm using that. What is your church doing when the lights are on? It's not about the light bill. But just think, it's worship, it's Sunday school, it's the ladies' Bible study on Tuesday night. What is happening when the lights are on? That's how we think about our electricity bill, and I love that.
Okay, here's another question. If you wanted to tithe, do you do it on your gross income or your net income?
I would start with the smaller and move to the larger, and then keep going. I've actually had people I've had people argue with that one on scripturally, which is interesting because the Leviticus sort of predates income tax, but there's not. I mean, if you go back to what Herb Gale summarized succinctly, we are called to live generously as Jesus lived. So there's not a hard and fast upper limit on our generosity, but nor is there we want to give regularly and proportionally as God has prospered us. So I don't think that we would want to say that tithing is necessarily the starting point for people who haven't given before. That's a bar that few of us reach. But if you were already tithing, you would pick one and then work up to more.
So there's a comment also about PAR, which is pre-authorized giving, versus envelopes, and an argument, a push for the envelopes because people can increase the amount they give in their envelopes, but once you're on PAR, it's kind of set. Any ideas for that? I
think this one is, you can increase your PAR. It's not as hard. I know all the forms are on your website, for instance, and there's absolutely no reason you can't do both. Set PAR as your baseline and then write a check to the church as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really like the discipline of the ongoing giving that PAR represents, because you go on vacation or you forget your checkbook or whatever, and PAR keeps along. If you wanted to preach on that one, I would say 1 Corinthians 16, 1-4 is just a lovely text on that, where Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he doesn't want to just show up and have to wring all this money out of them. He says, hey, start putting this money aside before I get there every week as God has prospered you. So if you've had a great week, put aside more. If you've had a barely paying the bills week, then you're going to have less. But, regularly put aside something. And so for people like most of us who are getting paid through our bank account, giving through our bank account really seems to fit the spirit of that one.
Great. There's just another comment, and this is from a minister saying that when he preaches, he asks his people not to be like the Dead Sea. Anyway, that's all the questions and comments I have that are written in the chat bar, Lori, if you want to keep going.
Okay. All right. So this last section that I've got here is some resources. This is me going, I've got books. Boy, do I have books. And just pulling out some that I felt might be the most helpful. Okay, I hope that you've heard of Ben Witherington III. He is a good theologian. He wrote this book called Jesus and Money. I should have written down the year. It's definitely within the past. It's relatively recent. The highlight would be page 165 to 169, which are 10 myths about money. It's American in context, which is difficult to avoid. It's a light read by theological standards, but it's not a light read by popular standards, if that makes any sense. But if this isn't something that you've studied before, and seminary didn't always study this, or seminary might have been a long time ago, or maybe seminary wasn't a thing, this is a good summary about what Jesus said about money. And it's relatively, you could get that one on Amazon for sure. This Joette Basler's book is a little bit older. I feel like I probably have this, that I've internalized this book. I've had it for so long and studied it so much. But if asking for money is something that you're really wondering, what did God say about that? And that's really kind of, you want to push up against that topic, then this is, I haven't seen another book like this, specifically looking about asking for money in the New Testament. Yeah, but so again, it's quite a specialty, but if that's something you really want to explore, that's the book. Money and Possessions by Walter Brueggemann. Need I say more? He's a master. This is an extensive treatment of money in the Old Testament and the New Testament. As a New Testament source, he cites Luke Timothy Johnson, who is another great scholar. And so the reference he cites there is Sharing Possessions, What Faith Demands. So that's another one you could look at. This is, without a doubt, the exegetical gold standard. And that said, it's also a really dense read. This isn't something that you're just going to nip out for Tuesday night Bible study. It's dense, and it is definitive, in my view. Okay, and you're saying, great, Laurie, I have 378 things on my to-do list, and so I also wanted to get something that was a little bit more accessible. And so a resource that I have, and in fact I have multiple versions of this same book, is A Christian View of Money, Celebrating God's Generosity. The fact that this book is in its 4th edition speaks well to it. It started off with my own tribe with Mennonites, but it's traveled a lot past then. I know that Mark Vincent has, for instance, worked with people from many other denominations, including on this book. And he's now, this 4th edition is one of his sons is actually the co-author, just to make sure that it is speaking in the language of the day. So this is very accessible. It has examples. It has case studies. There's questions in each chapter. It's all set up to go for a group study. So which of the other books, I'm afraid, are not, because they're just more theologically oriented. So this is by far and away the most accessible of the lot. It's not. It's meant to be used by a broad audience, and it is coincidentally available on Amazon for $23.30. I just wanted to ask if you have any questions. Are there any resources that you would want to recommend to this group, or other things that you found to be helpful?
I don't see anything right now.
Okay. So, just in the way of reintroducing myself, I'm Laurie Gunther-Reeser, and joyful fundraising for churches and charities is my thing. So there's my website if you wanted to look me up, or if you wanted to reach out, get me to come to your church or whatever, there's how you can do that. And please take advantage of the resources that the Presbyterian Church in Canada offers. And Karen is one of the gatekeepers to all those resources, and her contact information is there too. Again, to say thank you to the Presbyterian Church in Canada and to the Presbyterian Sharing Fund that has made this group discussion, this webinar possible. And yes, to thank the people, the generous people that have gone before, who have made the gifts that are why we're having this little chat. So thank you to those donors, and to you for taking the time to share with us today. I appreciate your input and your insights.
And Laurie, one of the participants shares, I just want to say that I've heard most of these webinars, but I never tire of hearing the info again. Thank you.
Oh, bless your heart. I feel like I say thank you, tell stories, and pay attention every single webinar, but those seem to me to be the main the main starting points.
Thanks for everyone who joined. We have our next Stewardship and Planned Giving webinar on Wednesday, November 14th, and that's with me. It's looking at some of the practical tools you can use for giving. So we've touched on this in some of the webinars, but we'll look at PAR and gifts of securities and annuities and all of those different ways, digital, online giving, and the tools that we have at the PCC to help your congregation. So that's a very practically oriented webinar, and if you've got treasurers who want to find out, or your envelope secretaries, have them join us, or they can watch the taped version, which are always posted online. So thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you next time.